Come on, bestie, let's do a Who's Overlooked Writers collab.
No! My giddy aunt. I haven't even done a Who's Overlooked Writers episode in over a year anyways. Oh damn, maybe I should catch up on that. And given that it's 2023, I want to analyse a writer whose episodes came out just a decade ago. Neil Cross. Neil Cross wrote 2 scripts for the revival run of Doctor Who, both of them being produced during Matt Smith's tenure as the 11th Doctor. The pair of them were single episodic adventures broadcast almost back to back in the series lineup, the former being The Rings of Akhaten, the second episode of Series 7B, and the latter entitled Hyde, the 4th episode of the same season. This occurred around roughly the midway point of Stephen Moffat's tenure as showrunner, as well as during the show's 50th anniversary year of 2013. So, during the course of the revival, we've had a fair few, what I'd consider special guest writers. You know how each showrunner basically had their own posse of regular contributors to their era. Take Moffat himself for instance. His tenure frequently featured the likes of his fellow Sherlock writers Mark Gatiss and Stephen Thompson, as well as others like Peter Harness, Toby Whithouse and so on, constantly returning to pen up space in the series lineup. But then occasionally he'd bring in someone like Neil Gaiman, a writer already widely revered in his own right for work like Good Omens and Coraline, to lend some of their own unique flair to the show, usually for 1 or 2 episodes only. Well, Neil Cross is kind of like that, as he had previously established himself as writer and creator of the popular British crime thriller Luther. Unlike Gaiman, however, Cross's involvement with Doctor Who has become pretty much a half-forgotten footnote in the revival's history. Now I'm here to ask the question, why is that? And I think I have a pretty decent answer as to why, but first, let's get a bit more specific about his episodes. If I can sum up any consistent trends in Neil Cross's writing style based on his 2 episodes here, I'd say he is primarily characterization and environment driven in his approach to Doctor Who. There are certainly plots and themes, and we'll get into those later, but both of these episodes champion world building as well as character interactions and dynamics above all else. The Rings of Akhaten in particular dedicates pretty much its entire first half simply to exploring and fleshing out this alien world. From its harmonious multiculturalism to its mythological perspectives, to its honestly rather thought-provoking sentimental approach to currency. Character-wise, outside of a couple of bit parts, there's only really the Queen and child prodigy Mary Gallel to speak of, although that sole focus is by design. Her primary conflict is an interesting subversion. You know how kids are often terrified of being the centre of attention when a task is expected of them. Like they worry that if they flub in front of a large group of people during a presentation or a play or whatever, then it'll be the end of the world. Well, in Mary's case, she has to stand in front of the gathered citizens of Akhaten and sing a tribute to the sleeping god. She is absolutely terrified of screwing this up, and Clara reassures her that she will do superbly and that everything will go fine. And yet when it does go wrong, it literally is the end of the world. A recurring trend of the 11th Doctor's era that's emblematic of Moffat's approach in general is the tendency for the show to empathise with children's fears and explore them, and Cross's work here slots pretty well into that creative mindset. Hyde's focus is similar, but because of the episode's horror tone, world-building is largely subdued in favour of character interactions, with the supporting roles occupied by that of troubled ex-soldier and current ghost hunter Professor Alec Palmer, and his psychic empath assistant Emma Grayling. Amidst their hobby of seeking out the paranormal, they are also emotionally trying to navigate the demons in their own heads, with the Professor coping with a bad case of the 1,000-yard stare, haunted by the memories of those he killed in battle. Wait, that's why he became a ghost hunter. Whoa, that's thematically deep! While Emma just... okay, let's put a pin in that for now. The bottom line is that characterization tends to be Cross's biggest focus in his Doctor Who work. But of course, that's not to ignore the plotting and overarching commentaries that both of his episodes put forward. The Rings of Akhaten focuses on the topic of organised religion, both positively and negatively. As I mentioned earlier, the first half of the episode is actually extremely light on plotting, instead choosing to bathe in the peaceful joie de vivre of a society brought together by their shared belief that their planetary system was the birthplace of all life in the universe. Usually this lack of plot for nearly 20 whole minutes of a 45-minute episode might present an issue, and in a way it kind of does. But at the same time, not only does this slow burn soaking in of local atmosphere and culture allow us to experience the unifying congregational power of religious belief, but it's also, in my opinion, easily the best part of the episode. Look, I'm a sucker for a slower pace, okay? Modern Who usually rapid fires through so much potentially rich storytelling content just so things stay snappy, a problem that even the latter half of this very episode suffers from, and I always appreciate when they just let the story breathe. This will come up again later in the video. Then in the second half, when it becomes clear that Mary's role is to be sacrificed to the old god, the focus of the episode shifts to the dark underbelly of organised religion, when otherwise harmless beliefs become hijacked and corrupted to satiate the greed of those with power in the congregation at the expense of the worshippers. Not the first time Doctor Who has explored this concept, of course, but it's always a worthy topic to explore nonetheless, and Akhaten does a perfectly decent job. So what about Hyde? What story is it trying to tell? Well, you see, Hyde is similarly going for a subversive premise. Despite being framed as a horror episode complete with all the trappings, a haunted house, a ghostly presence, cold spots, a psychic to connect with the spirit realm, and so on, appearing to gear itself towards the most primal human emotion, in actuality, it's thematically focused around the other most primal human emotion. You know, the not scary one, that still gets us flustered but in a different way. Yeah, it's intentionally wearing the aesthetics of a horror story, but at the end of the day, it's actually a tale about love. Okay. I know it's kind of cliche for sci-fi fans to roll their eyes when something takes a turn for the saccharine, but I swear I'm not just objecting to this idea purely because it's touchy-feely, okay? Nah, you see, such tonal subversions are an incredibly difficult balancing act, and extremely easy to screw up, and regrettably, I think this episode gets it completely off the mark. The ending is already pretty infamous in itself, with the reveal of the ominous monster actually being two distinct benevolent creatures separated across different universes and yearning for each other's companionship. And some people naively say it's just as simple as the story having a duff conclusion. But make no mistake, this theme is woven into the DNA of the whole episode. Emma's primary motivation is figuring out whether or not the professor wants to pork her. Their romance is used as a quirky parallel to not only the two creatures, but also to the Doctor and Clara's flirtationship, and even the ghost lady that serves as the main crux of the plot is revealed to be a long-distant result of Emma and the professor's eventual porking. Ergo, the theme of love is firmly embedded in the text throughout the entire episode, as evidenced by the fact that the ending twist uses all of these points to reframe the entire ghostly premise as a red herring. And you know, on paper, such a subversion could work. Hell, it would be pretty damn ambitious given the stark difference between the tone and the theme. But in execution, the precision needed to thread that needle is jolted by one major issue. The breakneck pacing. This is an issue that, again, I'll elaborate on later, but this episode cycles through its story beats so quickly that absolutely none of the horror atmosphere can land properly, and the romance angle ends up hitting with all the delicacy of a brick to the face. It doesn't help that the actual romantic writing itself is really stilted, probably by design to sell the awkwardness of budding love, but that still doesn't help the uneven tone at all. And if the romantic angle angle wasn't already tone-shattering enough, then the hard scientific wibbly-wobbly plot threads and explanations for everything paranormal will grind what little nuggets of spookiness were left into a fine powder. You see, exploring paranormal topics with a scientific mindset is in itself a delicate balancing act, which can and has been done well. Just take a look at any gothic horror-themed serial from the Hinchcliffe era. But it needs to be done with extreme care to assure that the pre-established moody tone remains intact even when you know the intricacies of what's going down. But this episode's approach is sledgehammer blunt and assures that won't be a possibility. Not just because of the pacing issue, but also because of the weird plot divergences, like the Doctor and Clara's mood-killing excursion to all of history, or that weird Clara TARDIS voice interface subplot that genuinely doesn't contribute anything. The nadir of all this comes in the form of the revelation that Emma's psychic abilities are so strong here because the Ghost Lady is her great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter, and this is a result of blood calling to blood across time, and that's the real power of love right there, and I'm just like, let your ghost story have some mystique, man. There's a reason why I didn't acknowledge this episode in my recommendations for Spooky Doctor Who in my Halloween video. All the tension just gets deflated like a balloon. Anyways, time for a brief intermission. What is the general fan consensus on Cross's 2 episodes? See, this is another one of those Donald Cotton situations, where the fandom wisdom on these 2 stories is actually the reverse of how I personally feel about them. In the DWM 2014 poll, fandom wasn't particularly kind to either of Cross's episodes, but were very critical towards the Rings of Akhaten in particular, infamously leaving it ranking at 233rd place out of all 241 entries at the time of voting, or in other words, 9th place from the bottom of the entire list, and the lowest ranked 11th Doctor story. We're talking Space Museum, Dominators, Meglost tier stuff here, and honestly, I do not get it. Do people just hate how sentimental it is? I mean, if so, that doesn't stop them being far kinder to the arguably far less justifiably saccharine Hyde, which fared a bit better on the poll, coming in at 119. Additionally, in 2023, DWM did another series of polls, this time focusing around ranking each story per Doctor's era, and the results relevant to these 2 stories were interesting. Where in 2014 fandom generally considered The Rings of Akhaten to be the worst story of the 11th Doctor's era, 9 years later the criticisms had softened somewhat to the point that it is now generally considered the 6th worst, out of 39 total. This episode just can't catch a break, can it? Meanwhile, Hyde, which had previously been rated as the 20th highest 11th Doctor story in the 2014 poll, had since shifted up 1 place for 2023. Interesting. Well, before I discuss the main characters, I want to finally acknowledge what I think is a major reason as to why both of Cross's episodes are overlooked in the eyes of the audience, and why they, at least in the time and environment they came out, never stood a chance. So, as stated earlier, both of Cross's episodes were part of Series 7B. Series 7 as a whole was, quite infamously in retrospect, crafted to be the 45-minute blockbuster season. No two-parters, each episode is basically standalone, hour-long installments are out of the question unless it's Christmas, but all were encouraged to have big, high-scale concepts regardless. Moffat wanted to achieve compressed storytelling, and envisioned each episode to be its own standalone movie-like experience. Movie-like. At 45 minutes. So, right off the bat, I think this was an absolutely terrible idea that was doomed to sink the series from its inception. Modern Who by this point had already been having trouble straining the limits of the 45-minute format, but this self-contradictory idea took it to another level entirely. I imagine it was conceived to make the show feel more cinematic and culturally relevant, but all it did in the end was hurt the episodes it encompassed. As a result, every story in Series 7 feels overconstricted, oftentimes contrived, and worst of all, artificially artificially stunted. And while Cross's episodes aren't the hardest hit examples, they're no Nightmare in Silver or Power of Three, the negative effects of cramming them into this format are still certainly evident. Nearly all of my aforementioned issues with Hyde might, keyword might, have been improved or maybe even outright corrected if the story simply had the time to flesh itself out and possessed the necessary pacing to make its tonal shifts fit naturalistically. And while I complimented The Rings of Akhaten earlier for its first half slowing things down and letting the environment breathe, well, that's a double-edged sword that really backfires onto the latter half, because not only does the plot's pacing suddenly skyrocket into the stratosphere to compensate, but also a couple of honestly rather unnecessary twists happen to ensure that the scope of the adventure drastically inflates to achieve that superficial blockbuster-like sense of scale. At 31 minutes 45 seconds, they reveal that the old god is actually the freaking son of the Akhaten system, and by 40 minutes 45 seconds, that son has been defeated. In the span of 9 minutes, they revealed that a goddamn star is the villain, and then stopped that star. Yeah, you can make your climax as emotionally charged as you want, have Matt Smith pour his blood, sweat and tears into a power ballad of a monologue to try and sell it, and coat the whole thing in a sentimental drizzle, but at the end of the day, that is still ludicrously fast-paced for the content of the plot. Let your story breathe. The thing is, I don't think I can even entirely blame Cross himself, or even necessarily Moffat for this, because these issues are bigger than any one writer. Modern Doctor Who, both then and now, is just expected to be fast, snappy, to the point. It's the 21st century. Doctor Who can't have sluggish pacing anymore like those 70s six-parters. God no, do you want the kids to get bored? Pump every stimulant we've got into the show. I know I'm probably sounding like a classic Who elitist hipster right now, but this attitude ends up causing a lot of harm to what may otherwise be decent ideas that can and do have a lot to say, and I just want those ideas to be executed to their best possible versions. But stories like The Rings of Akhaten and Hyde are just two examples from a whole season which staunchly refuse to allow that for the sake of a marketing gimmick, and as a result, whatever ideas Neil Cross may have had for Doctor Who never reached their full potential. That's my assumption as to why people aren't so hot on either of his episodes. And again, it's not even necessarily his fault, it's just a bad marketing decision squandering his creativity. Anyway, the only other thing I really have left to talk about is how both of Cross's stories showcase the lead characters. Now, the 11th Doctor and Clara are a duo I've never been overly fond of, mainly because I'm not particularly comfortable with, how should I put it, the Doctor's objectification of Clara, obsessing over her mystery like she's his trophy to win, and treating her actual personality as an afterthought. Now, I get that to some degree the show doesn't endorse this behaviour, but at the same time I also feel like it doesn't really go far enough in being self-reflective about it either, which in all fairness is probably yet another side effect of the aforementioned pacing issue. However, upon rewatching The Rings of Akhaten in particular, I was pleasantly surprised by what I experienced of the pair of them here. Sure, we do get the creepy stalking scene at the beginning, but aside from that, this episode honestly showcases the best sides of the 11th Doctor. Other episodes in the season, like Journey to the Centre of the TARDIS or Nightmare in Silver, really single-mindedly zero in on the Clara objectification aspect, but I think Akhaten achieves a pretty good balance, showcasing that he does actually care about her input, enthusiastically wanting to make her first trip to an alien world a memorable and pleasant experience, as well as passionately teaching her about his moral code. I also really dig how self-conscious and respectful he is here. I'm often irked by how socially oblivious the 11th Doctor is made to behave purely for the sake of comedy, but in this outing he actually does seem to be pretty in tune with the world and culture around him, which I feel is more in line with the Doctor's general demeanour regardless of incarnation. And Clara herself herself is honestly more naturalistic here than I remember too. I never really cared for her plucky, doe-eyed demeanour in this series, and there is still a little bit of that here too, don't get me wrong, but Cross did help to flesh out a more down-to-earth side to her in this instalment. Also, I do appreciate her having agency in their dynamic at the end, affirming that she wants to be viewed as a person in her own right and not as a comparison to someone else. A rare Series 7 W. As for Hyde though, Lord knows what happened, but lightning certainly didn't strike twice here. There's the odd moment that's compelling, but on the whole, the 11th Doctor reverts right back to socially oblivious wackadoo with an unhealthy interest in Clara, the latter of whom has readopted the sassy Hermione Granger attitude, and the aforementioned romantic theme is used to highlight a flirty dynamic between them, and it's just gross. Also, the way the Doctor actually comes to the conclusion that these two creatures must be star-crossed lovers doesn't remotely scan in-universe. Okay, you've noticed there's two of them. That could just mean you've got double trouble. Or maybe the one in the house is just a projection of what's in the pocket universe akin to that of the ghost lady. The only logical conclusion is that the Doctor can read the script and knows the writer's intent. Oh, Clara, I've made a thematic parallel. The creatures reflect the character dynamic between the Professor and Emma, as well as that of you and I. Your skirt really is a bit too tight. Yeah, this is some real Jekyll and Hyde stuff. Though maybe this was Moffat's script editing interference, who knows. Right, time to wrap this up. Neil Cross strikes me as a pretty fitting writer for Doctor Who, with the right attitude when it comes to world building and, for the most part, characterization, even if he is certainly on the more sentimental end in terms of his ideas for the show. That said, I strongly believe he really needs to be given the space to actually flesh out his vision effectively, and sadly, the structure of the season his episodes ended up in didn't allow for that. And again, that's not entirely his fault. I think his episodes are more a victim of circumstances than by any inherent failings in his craft, but at the same time, these two stories just are what they are, and judging by them, unfortunately, I do understand why his output isn't as cherished as it could have been. He really was handed a bad deck. What could have been, eh? There's an infinity of potential there.